Welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I'm your host, Corey, and today we have a very special guest, Sam Miller. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for being here. Welcome. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me, Corey. I'm doing great. Excited to chat all things metabolism and nutrition today.
I know that in this realm, there are a lot of individuals listeners of this podcast, who probably are already familiar with you. But for those who are just seeing you for the first time, listening to you for the first time, can you let them know who you are, what you do in health and fitness? Because you do a lot.
Yeah, that's such a loaded question, I feel like, but I'll try my best to consolidate it for the purpose of a podcast intro. So, if you're not following me, I'm excited to meet you here through this show with Corey. My background is I've been in the health and fitness space for over 17 years now, kind of started off as a complex case myself after having a pretty significant head injury in my teens. And I was always passionate about personal training, nutrition, fitness. Started working in a gym at a very young age. I've pretty much had every fitness job you can imagine, from cleaning treadmills and being inside a campus recreation facility on a college campus, to even being able to work with coaches at a higher level, mentoring health and fitness professionals around the world. So whether it's making people's protein shakes, meal prepping, cleaning exercise equipment, I've probably done it. Started off just trying to figure out and find some answers for myself when it came to my health, my hormones, metabolism, making progress in terms of my physique, which led me down kind of the rabbit hole, getting the itch to compete. I've competed in both bodybuilding and men's physique previously, and then kind of segued into working with a lot of lifestyle and gen pop clients, because I found that a lot of these sort of complex cases and different metabolic issues were becoming more prevalent and landing on my digital doorstep, whether that was social media or email, just connecting with folks from all different walks of life who had a number of different health issues or complications and weren't really getting the attention and quality of care or coaching that they deserved, whether that be from a health and fitness coach or they were maybe frustrated with a Western medical professional. And so for really over the last decade, I've just been bridging the gap between kind of traditional macro coaching and what you see in terms of sets, reps, and calorie counting, and then kind of spanning all the way to kind of this gray area between metabolism and medicine. So obviously there's so many questions we have about our health that go far beyond just kind of the clipboard personal training approach of what we're doing in the gym and having basic kind of periodized training and some macros for our nutrition. But there's also a lot of answers that we always don't get from our doctors when it comes to our health, and not everything requires a pill or procedure. So I kind of carved a little space for myself in the industry, focusing on that area. And then over time, I really tend to emphasize that, and also working with coaches to help them do the same. Throughout that process led me to creating my podcast, Sam Miller Science. And then recently, within the past couple of years, releasing the book, Metabolism Made Simple. And now I connect with folks like Corey and making content like this.
Thank you. I really think that one of the more important parts that um, I see on my digital doorstep is the individuals who are seeking answers, seeking clarity, which you touched on. This is a huge part of everything that you do, is um, getting clarity around the root of the issue. And I think oftentimes in this space, whether it's a physique athlete or a recreational athlete, someone who maybe doesn't have the intention to get on stage, but definitely wants to treat what they're doing seriously, and they want that attention to detail. Oftentimes that can be overlooked by the coach or the provider. I think to kick us off, I think this can start really simple. How do we define a healthy metabolism, or just what does that look like to you? Someone comes to you, what are the presenting symptoms of someone with a healthy metabolism?
For sure. So we can look at this both conceptually or philosophically, and then also some quantitative markers of metabolic health. So if we're just thinking of it from a conceptual perspective, metabolism is basically a measure of stress and energy, or kind of gauging your levels of stress in your environment and inside your body at all times, as well as relative energy availability, which basically means food and calories, both in terms of caloric consumption, the calories stored on your body as body fat, and then also our energy expenditure. So your body is always very closely and tightly regulating these things through basically what is our endocrine system and a variety of other sort of full body systems that help us to adapt to stimulus on a regular basis. So conceptually, that's really what's going on. It's like sensing stressors in our environment, kind of like a thermostat. It's not just the calories in, calories out conversation, but it's also not just hormones and gut health and kind of holistic vibes either. We need to integrate the two in a conversation of metabolism. And metabolism is essentially just a series of bodily processes that are going on all the time. Is really, if you were to look like a scientific textbook or the definition in an encyclopedia, that's what you're going to find, is really more in regards to like bodily function or process. But what most people in the fitness industry are thinking when they talk about metabolism is really more that energy and stress regulation, because that's what's playing into the loss of body fat and your ability to also build muscle or recomp. From a quantitative perspective, we're looking at metabolism. We really want to be considering things like our insulin sensitivity, our thyroid function, maybe even reproductive hormones, as well, as that can kind of play into this overall conversation, and levels of systemic inflammation and cellular health. So if you were to look at this from a blood chemistry perspective, I'm looking at insulin sensitivity. That could be things like your fasting insulin and A1C and fasted blood glucose. From a thyroid perspective, that's looking at both TSH, free T4, free T3, these different markers that are going to give us sort of a pulse on our metabolic health and how our body is functioning through a look at these systems. Now, it'd be kind of time consuming and a little bit exhausting to go through every single possible marker of metabolic health on the podcast. It's something that takes quite a bit of time to have a significant amount of education in that area, but just understanding like, hey, philosophically, this is what's going on in one area, but then I can also quantify this through looking at my metabolic health through something like blood work, and that's going to help us get that full picture of what's going on. You can also track this in your lifestyle as well. So maybe you're someone who doesn't have health testing under your belt or any sort of experience or access to that. What we would want to look at would be things like even tracking your food is a very basic way to start gauging metabolic health, metabolic function, energy expenditure relative to things like your scale weight, body tape measurements. So we can start with the basics with more of a beginner client, and you can kind of scale that up to more advanced metrics if you're working with someone who's, say, a competitor or someone with performance and longevity goals.
I love it. And I absolutely would not hold you hostage and make you go through every system. Apologies for any listeners who were hoping that was going to be the case. I think oftentimes people can get lost in the weeds of these objective markers and lose sight of the subjective ones, the qualitative ones that frankly I find with myself and then with clients, they play a really significant role in the client's perception of the diet itself, or in maybe in a non-fat loss phase of the energy state that they're in. But really when it comes to teaching the client or even educating the client on the initial intake assessment, I'm positive you have this probably in the highest of volumes as far as coaches get, but the clients that come to you that say like, I can't lose weight, this belief that it truly is related to, I guess, a permanent state, that there's an inability, a cessation, a true impedance of weight loss. What do you think? What do you, I guess, really your process with first establishing why that belief is there? What does that look like for you and that client?
So I think if you're a coach and you encounter this frequently, it can be easy to get frustrated, and your natural reaction, if you're a newer or intermediate coach, might be to even get frustrated. Like, is this client being honest? Does this person genuinely think that they've stalled in their progress? Is there a metabolic health issue at hand? And really, the best advice I could give you in this situation is just to genuinely get curious, to kind of trust and verify what the client is experiencing. Are there going to be situations where there's an adherence issue, or we need to modify some lifestyle factors and behaviors to get things moving again? 100%. Will that happen sometimes? Sure. But there are also clients who are, it's valid that they're experiencing these frustrations, and there's some things going on a deeper level. And it's not really their job to explain the deeper science, right? They're coming to you as a coach or health professional because they're frustrated. And so our job is to alleviate some of those frustrations and really speed the progress that they're looking for when it comes to their transformation, fat loss, muscle building, etc. So I like to start with a food log no matter what. I think that is a key foundation of any coaching relationship. If someone is more intermediate to advanced, they've likely been tracking their food or macros or some type of portions in some way. If they're a total beginner and they have reached a point of stagnation or a plateau with their weight loss, what I prefer to do is approach the situation with education first and then move to action steps. I also don't think you should make a ton of assumptions. So, again, with getting curious, you're going to ask the client what they're doing. What have they tried so far? What has worked for them in the past? Is that not working anymore? We can start there. And then we can kind of scale the data up. So, your very baseline things you're going to need would be rough idea of movement and energy expenditure through the day. Things like daily step count work as a great proxy here. Things like your food log help to establish clients' eating patterns. And yes, are there clients who eat things that are not tracked? 100%. But there's also going to be a significant chunk of clients who are being forthright with their tracking. And, also they are going to the gym, and we can sort of audit that through things like training videos and stuff to see how intense is the training. Are we really exerting ourselves in the gym? We can always audit those things. But I think it's an information gathering process first. And again, with that curiosity, it makes it a lot easier to gather information without getting frustrated because you're trying to find the constraint or the roadblock that the person's experiencing. Fortunately, I'm at a point in my career where a lot of the cases that I see are brought to me through coaches in our specialization program. And so their clients do have access through us to a variety of different health testing or lab testing. And we're able to kind of pinpoint what that roadblock or constraint might be. So regardless of what's going on, whether it's maybe a more advanced issue or something that's easy to pinpoint, we can identify it rather quickly and get things moving. So I'd say there's going to be, if we were to divide this into buckets or kind of subsets of clients, there's clients who have an awareness issue in that it's their awareness doesn't necessarily match their behavior. So their level of understanding of why they're not seeing results is kind of mismatched. So that can be, basically we can remedy that situation through just building that relationship with the client, having conversations and educating them on the appropriate action steps to fix it, right? That's like the client who thinks they're in a deficit, but they're not in a deficit, or they think they're training super hard, but they're not actually training super hard. Or when we go and look at adherence overall, it's the person who knocks it out of the park Monday through Thursday, but then like Friday through Sunday, they have no idea what they're doing and just kind of like going off the rails. So some of it will be an adherence issue, sure, but that's usually going to be clients who are maybe a little bit less experienced, a little bit less time under tension in the transformation process, so to speak. I think as we get to more intermediate to advanced a client base, we're going to be checking things like their biofeedback, signs of fatigue, low energy, low libido, digestive issues. We really want to get to the root cause of why they might experience this weight loss plateau, because the fat loss stagnation may just be a symptom of a deeper issue. So a lot of times when we have the issue of not losing body fat or our body not being as responsive to a given nutritional stimulus or training stimulus, it's actually because there's something going on beneath the surface of that transformation. And whether that's a hormonal issue, gut health, systemic inflammation, et cetera, blood sugar regulation, those things can drive changes not only in our behavior, but in our body's response to that training or nutrition stimulus. So that's kind of where I would start and say that there's sort of 2 to 3 buckets that clients may fall into. And you just want to be careful not to assume that someone's just lying to you out of the gate, because there are going to be clients who are they're genuinely frustrated and they've hired a coach before and they did what that coach said and they didn't see results and now they're coming to you. So be patient with it. It's easy to have kind of a snap reaction, but I'd encourage you to do a little bit of investigation before you reach that point of frustration.
I love that. That was said, articulated incredibly well. And I think that's something with any experienced coach, you'll see that there is an air of curiosity that is um, demonstrated at all points prior to jumping to any kind of conclusions, because ultimately I've been on the receiving end of that, both in coaching as well as in other industries where you have the professional who wants to tell you essentially, oh no, here's the root of your issue without asking some very rudimentary questions. And I think one of the pitfalls of that is ultimately you begin to troubleshoot issues that potentially aren't there, that don't exist, or you've now convinced the client that they need to chase this rabbit that frankly it's not the primary culprit. Maybe it very much is real and part of their experience, but simply pointing the finger at let's say variables that frankly aren't moving the needle that much, it could cost them a lot of time, a lot of effort. And if someone's already frustrated, that's the last thing that you want to exploit or you really want to use up at that point. I think in this process, big an overlooked aspect of the fitness journey, but whether that be in fat loss or in a caloric surplus, is the dietary fatigue. And I use the word diet, but I just mean any kind of regimen that you're following and the rigidity that's required to adhere to it. I think that plays a significant role in the client's ability to sustain the program, but also their belief in the program. And that's something I know for my clients, I really do try to emphasize and keep a pulse on out the gate. What is their perception of what we're doing? How hard is it for them to maintain these efforts? Because it's great if I tell them, yeah, it's the optimal program, this is exactly what you should do to get to this destination. But if at max they're able to follow it, let's say 4 to 6 weeks, or in the case of a contest prep, you're able to cross the finish line, but you have all of this dietary debt to then pay it off afterwards. Well, how much progress did we actually make? And how costly is it going to be paying off that debt after the fact?
100%. I think the dietary debt aspect, it was very, very well said, as well as the fatigue. So what we're looking at is basically a period of restraint, right? Whether it's calories or other behaviors that we're either abstaining from, or certain things we're engaging in that maybe we weren't doing before in terms of training or extra cardio. And just to give someone a specific example, in terms of non-needle moving activities, I see a lot of coaches, especially if they're earlier on to maybe prepping clients or working with someone who's stalling in their fat loss, they just like add more cardio, for example, right? Or just like add more longer duration, low intensity, steady state, or more intervals or something like that. But if the client's very fatigued or their output is decreasing, we're reaching a point where maybe they're doing more, but there's a point of diminishing returns. And so that would be an example of like something that's not really moving the needle super far. I just wanted to provide something more tangible
Mm.
versus this like super fluffy concept of what might be going on in a transformation. So for the person who's having that fatigue accumulate and having a harder time maintaining that output, whether it be in terms of high intensity interval training or low intensity steady state cardio, and they're just like going through the motions, we may need to make some adjustments to actually see progress from that. Or there could be a reason why we're not seeing the results because we've added stress and body burden and basically the stimulus the person's not responsive to. And maybe they're in a fat loss phase when they actually needed a health phase because they have a consistent history of chronic dieting with large depths of deficits, frequent deficits, and like longer duration of caloric deficits, right? So if that's the case, maybe it's just you're kind of pushing or pulling on the wrong toggle, and we need to consider, okay, maybe we need to take an alternative approach for a while. So that would be an example of kind of non-needle moving activity that has a point of diminishing returns. It's not that you're never going to do it with that client or that it doesn't work for some clients, but you're basically using the wrong stimulus or even the right stimulus at the wrong time. It's kind of mismatched with what's going on with the client's physiology at that point.
I love that. And I really do think having specificity in these topics, I mean, I think that can I think those can be teaching points for clients because, I mean, oftentimes these areas are left very ambiguous. And I would say, Even on in that example, when you take a client who there isn't continuity in how they're measuring training performance, and it's just this blanket protocol of, train. I mean, even an RIR and RPE is still, I would say, more specific than the industry standard of training
Yeah.
protocols.
Yeah.
But if you have an athlete, which is oftentimes in my case, you have athletes who are given a training split, told to train really hard. Maybe you'll get the occasional active calorie burn target, which sickens me, but okay, specifically for weightlifting. But in those cases, if you have an athlete where we're running up output continuously throughout, let's say, a state of low energy availability, it's like, okay, you got to imagine that there's going to be some kind of drop off in training performance. Now, what's the cost to that? Is that ultimately, especially for athletes who are unassisted or unenhanced, does that decrease, that transient decrease in training performance? Hopefully it's transient, maybe it's acute. Does that lead to muscle loss? Does that lead to shifts in the composition that, could be muddying up that data and ultimately leading to worse outcomes? So I think that's a consideration as well, as, what's the opportunity cost of pulling on some of these levers that are very low hanging, and very overused. Now, I guess this kind of moves back into the abstract nature of the conversation, and that's the adherence and the sustainability of what one's doing. When you take an athlete, let's say in your case where you have athletes who have high aspirations, they want to achieve maybe body fat levels they haven't been at previously. So there is this understanding that they're going to have to dig and challenge themselves in a way, and maybe experience physiological adaptations that are understood. They're going to be temporary, but they are an associated cost, an accepted cost. What is that process like with coaching that athlete on really what you need from them in terms of communication around these adaptations that, frankly, you want to know about? They're important, but don't necessarily necessitate pulling back, at least every time.
Yeah. So I'll give a framework that I use with both lifestyle jump hop and athletes, and then how you maybe adjust it and modify it depending on who you're working with. Also, transparently, has been a while since I've personally been responsible for prepping someone start to finish. So, while I've certainly done that in the past years prior, a lot of times I'm brought in for like oversight on labs or health issues and certain things now that are a little bit different than a conventional prep journey. So the adherence piece, I can speak to what I've done previously and some of my favorite communication tools just to monitor athletes' progress, and even, your lifestyle and gym pop clients as well. And one of those things that I view as, paramount importance during whether it's a prep or someone who's trying to improve their health, it could be either, is looking at biofeedback. And so we can scale this up or down depending on the health issue. But I always start with the basics, going through an acronym that I call SHREDS. So we go through sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress. And whether someone's trying to step on stage or not, that's always going to be important to check. And we want both qualitative and quantitative markers. Now, again, some of these will still be subjective in nature, kind of like an RAR or RPE. But if someone is the same person and has the same perception of what tired feels like or what fatigue feels like, and if they're using anything to quantify or track their sleep, we can at least keep a pulse on what's going on in their transformation. And so I started to use that because as I had more complex clients and different cases, I realized I need something that tells them, hey, I need to communicate about these 5 or 6 things every single week. Or if you actually are working with an athlete and someone's stepping on stage, that's actually going to be daily and sometimes even every few hours, depending on how far you are into that prep. And the person's goals, aspirations, and kind of the playing field that we're looking at. So this is going to look a lot different for maybe a regional show versus an Olympia athlete. So again, communication cadence is going to depend on the goal. But by starting with that basic framework, knowing we're looking at sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress, typically signs of metabolic adaptation, we're first going to have lower energy. We are likely seeing a slightly higher stress response. As we get further into the diet, we will see some sleep impairments as a result of carbohydrate and calorie restriction. A lot of times too, we're taking stimulants, caffeines, or excuse me, caffeine, stimulants, and or I was thinking other fat burners in my mind. Like I was about to switch to kind of like other enhancements, and I said caffeines. So hope you guys got a kick out of that one. Your caffeines, your coffee, your energy drinks, whatever your go-to is, your pre-workout. But that would also be in prep. Obviously, certain individuals are using things like Clen, or maybe even if it's yohimbine or something that has a bit of a stimulant effect, or some can leave people feeling jittery or wired and tired. So you're not necessarily limited to just like your conventional cup of coffee. Obviously, if you've prepped before, you're familiar with different things that can impact that. Even thyroid, for example, you may see a change in energy levels as that's being adjusted or titrated. So, sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress are all signs of metabolic adaptation and the direction we are headed in terms of our caloric restriction and how that energy restriction is manifesting in terms of bodily symptoms. So sleep tends to decline in quality and sometimes quantity because, again, we can get very hungry when we're moving through a deficit phase, especially if you're getting very, very lean. It is normal to be hungry, just to kind of normalize that for everyone. You're also likely going to see some changes in your digestion. And if you are someone who's a repeat dieter, or you're doing multiple shows back to back, or you're a lifestyle client, this is the leanest you've gotten before, or we're starting to see metabolic adaptation, it is not uncommon that after we see some changes in things like thyroid hormone and stress hormones, we'll then later see progression into reproductive hormone issues or complications, changes in fertility or menstrual cycles. And then really the next kind of domino to fall tends to actually be our gut health. So when we have compromised thyroid function, or we're hypothyroid or subclinical hypothyroid, we often see slowed motility. And that combined with the stress of dieting and contest preparation, we will sometimes see something called gut dysbiosis, which a lot of that is going to carry back to having lower stomach acid in a contest prep. So when people are high stress, they're consuming caffeine, we may have some micronutrient deficiencies. There's a lot that we're putting our body through, both from a dietary perspective and from a training perspective. We can have this sort of cascade that happens. And so if we can be monitoring sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress, we can start to see, okay, energy levels are starting to come down. Recoverability isn't quite what it was when calories were higher. Maybe we're seeing some changes in stress and sleep. And then digestion, we're going to keep an eye on that and manage it as best we can throughout the entire process. But sometimes immediately following the prep phase, especially if people are pushing food really fast in a reverse diet, or sometimes even at the tail end of the diet, we can see some of those gut issues and sometimes telltale signs like bloating, um, alternating sort of changes in your bowel movements. There's a lot that can transpire and happen as a result of the stress that we put our bodies under with dieting. So from a qualitative perspective or communication perspective, what I'm looking at in those check-ins, I'm going to start with just your basic shreds. And then I do have something that I call more of a symptom scorecard or advanced biofeedback questionnaire. And that's a tool that we use to dive into different bodily systems if we haven't yet had some health testing done, or we're going to use those in tandem as sort of parallel resources. One looking at subjective feedback from the client, and then the other thing is going to be more quantitative data from serum labs. And then comparing those two together, we can really get a nice picture of what's going on for that client. So that's my like preferred communication strategy, building off of biofeedback and client perceptions of what they're experiencing. I will say from an adherence perspective, I think this is very individual. So some people are kind of just like, they set their mind to it, they do it, they put their head down, they don't really struggle with adherence. And then there are clients, depending on diet history, depending on their goals, their enjoyment of the process, the coach that they're working with, their overall community support system, what's in their house, right? So like who's doing the grocery shopping, what's in their pantry. Like adherence is a much more um, I wouldn't say variable, but adherence is subjective, and it's also going to depend very much on the client. So I don't necessarily have like a hack for adherence, but I would say if I had to give a tip on something that's underrated, is look at more environmental context cues for the
Mm-hmm.
client and then try to support them from an adherence perspective by coaching them through their environment versus like setting some sort of rigidity that worked for another client onto that person because they're basically operating in an entirely different prep ecosystem. That would probably be my best advice, but I don't know that I have like one go-to sort of trick or tip for adherence in that respect.
No, I couldn't agree more. Adherence is a pretty nasty beast for a lot of people, and the ones that struggle with it typically are at a point of frustration. I would say, like, majority of clients where adherence is um, non-adherence is a pattern. I find that it's like dissecting and really getting to the root of it usually isn't as straightforward as just giving them rules to follow, or giving them, I would say, like a sandbox to work within. I feel like there are a lot of people who, disassociate and avoid really those bouts of non-adherence, like within themselves, and just chalk it up to, I didn't have enough motivation, I wasn't as disciplined as I should have been. And I think something that, through my experience coaching, that I found to be really helpful, is using an adherence like scaling criteria and almost asking those clients. I've worked with a few clients where I've had them do this on and off, when adherence began to slip, and it essentially, like, this is all under the guise that, scale 1 to 5, you're still adherent, you're still technically on plan. But what is the gradient? Like, when do you begin to feel that you want to be non adherent? When do you begin to have those urges to deviate? And then once we can establish something that is a little more quantitative, okay, in this, let's say, a fat loss phase, it's not a prep, because frankly, during a prep, I think even the most disciplined will have urges to be non adherent. But in this fat loss phase, if you're finding that, you're getting away from a body fat set point that you're comfortable at, and you're getting to a point where things are feeling a little dicey, maybe stress in the home life, that's, rearing its head. So you're beginning to have those days where adherence is not a 4 or 5. So, motivation's high. You could be tempted, but you wouldn't go off track. You're starting to get to that point, where maybe you wake up, your food isn't prepared, and you're like, fuck, it'd be nice to just like not track and not eat what's on plan and just grab whatever's convenient, or not eat right now and just fast and then just have something, whatever my mind desires later. And I think what I found to be successful, in at least identifying the root cause, was finding those patterns. What are the environments that are encouraging non-adherence? What are the environments and the triggers that are essentially that decision right before you decide to go off plan? What does that look like? And because essentially, I mean, like, adherence is just making that decision again and again to not go off track. And there's a point in anyone's internal dialogue where they, just put the towel in the bucket and they're like, okay, well, we're going to do this. And to what extent do you have the ability to pause and stop and ask yourself, okay, do I really want to do this? Does 100% of me want to move forward with this behavior? And I think being patient with clients and giving them the space to explore what those triggers are. I think ultimately it might not correct the issue. It might just be, hey, the state you're in, the environment you're in is not supportive of you, fighting these temptations, but at least we're getting warmer. We're getting closer to the times in which adherence is going to be harder. And thereby we can at least anticipate, when does adherence need to be the highest? When do you need to protect yourself and at least create an environment, or ensure that you're in an environment where you're not going to fail? Because I think for a lot of clients, they can feel as if it's random and it just happens sporadically, and they don't have any kind of clues or signs as to when that behavior could be predicted or anticipated. So I love that you do have multiple tools in place for clients to track those objective measures. I have that. I have a similar idea with my clients where we look at the objective, but then the subjective. That's really going to highlight whether or not the traditional changes to the program make sense, whether they're appropriate. If I have someone who, yeah, they're technically losing weight, but they're like, hey, I'm getting into that yellow orange zone of like, I'm going to break. It's not going to be long before I go off plan. Well, then even if fat loss slows temporarily, even if it's still occurring, but it's not as fast, well, does it make sense to dig them into a deeper dietary hole? Not necessarily.
Right. So I did think of one tip that I think is universally applicable for both athletes, Gen Pop, lifestyle. And I think you really did a great job of sort of assessing and analyzing what parts of this are a result of a lack of self awareness for the client, right? So through the rating system that you discussed, right, we're creating awareness around the client's state of being and what's driving these behaviors. I think that's fantastic. From a conventional, like if you were to go look in a psych journal or read about this from like a behavior change perspective, you're going to see a lot on like self-efficacy and self-sabotage. But I'm going to give you guys something, just kind of an entirely different perspective based on what I've seen both in coaching, personal professional development over the years, and also with prep athletes. But this will work for someone who's not prepping as well. The biggest thing is when people are adherent, especially athletes at a very high level, it's because they identify as someone who is adherent, and they also identify as the person who kind of already has their goals. So someone who's stepping on stage, is trying to qualify for that pro card, or they already are a pro and they're competing at the pro level, but they want to go to the Olympia. They part of becoming uh, that version of yourself is you kind of have to see it and begin to bring it to life through your behaviors. And I think individuals who do have, whether it's coming from motivation or whether it's simply this sort of stick to itiveness and like they're disciplined and they're getting after it even when they're not super motivated, I think it's because they're able to reverse engineer that this is the person that I need to be in order to win this. This is the person I need to be in order to look this way. And this is how I have to conduct myself in order to accomplish the goals that I have. And people who have a very tightly regulated sort of compass with that usually have an easier time in the straight and narrow because they don't really view the alternative as an option. Whereas to the person who struggles with adherence, really what you were talking about there was temptation, and they view temptation as a very realistic option or a high likelihood that they're going to cave to that temptation, whereas the other individual simply doesn't view it as part of their process. It's not part of the roadmap of where they're going or where they want to be, and they know that they're not going to cave into that, or that there's a time and a place where they'll be able to enjoy those things or give into that temptation, but that time is not right now. And so I think there's a degree of both autoregulation, but through this self-awareness that they have, it's also seeing, I'm not where I want to be just yet, but I can be that person. I'm becoming that person. And my identity is a person who's, going to stick, with these behaviors. And even if it might be the convenient or easy thing to do today because I don't have food prepped or I don't want to track or I want to fast, like we were discussing in the last little segment, it's, I'm going to do this anyway, in spite of all of those things, even if it's not the most convenient thing, because that is who I am. Right. And so when we're able to reach that point, which is very tough, right? This is why it takes time for people to become great athletes, or why it takes time for people to be, fantastic at anything in life, is because we have to be able to build that. And a lot of times we can't build it yet because we haven't seen it, we haven't tasted it yet, we don't realize. And this is where something like coaching and mentorship can be super powerful, is someone can actually sort of lay the path down for you of this is what's going to be required of you to reach this point. And once you know what's required and how the type of the person you want to be behaves, to whether it's to win that pro card or to set a PR in the gym next week or to get that job promotion, whatever it is that you're aspiring to do, once you're able to make that path a little bit clearer and tie it back to your aspirations, I think it can help to diminish some of the temptation that's there. Now, I will say there are physiological components to hunger and cravings that we can certainly dive into. That would be helpful in terms of our like homeostatic and hedonic eating systems. That's natural for that to rear its head during a deep deficit or any type of diet phase, any type of contest prep. You're going to have both of those signals, both kind of the what feels like mental and physical hunger cues, or really more the mental part is the cravings and temptation, whereas the physiological or physical sensation is the hunger. That's going to happen. But I think the person who's expects that to happen and is going to stick with their program anyways, there's a level of preparedness there. And I think it's just helping them to be a little more resilient through the process. So I hope that helps. In addition to kind of the communication frame, it's also how we're thinking of ourselves. And sometimes when we let that identity slip a little bit, it's when we start to engage in behaviors that are not like us, right? Whereas that high performer, that elite athlete, they see that alternative of not prepping the meals or not doing the thing, and they're like, that's not like me, right? So I'm not going to engage in that. I'm not going to entertain that. I'm not going to do that because that wouldn't serve me. So I think when you can get to that level, it's an entirely different conversation. The challenge is probably 80 to 90% of your clients are not there yet. And so as a coach, your job is to help them to eventually reach that place, or so they can just see that that's even a possibility, because they might not even be entertaining that idea right now.
Extremely well said. And I think to continue on that instance where you do have really the decision to give into temptation or to essentially build equity to become the person that you believe you can become. I think being aware enough to have that internal dialogue with yourself and encourage, like, hey, this is my chance. This is another opportunity that, frankly, like, you don't get that every day. Because if someone doesn't have temptation, it's really easy for them. You have someone who lives in, let's say, a very isolated sense. They don't expose themselves to any temptations ever, and this can cross apply to anything that doesn't fall in line with your goals. You don't have the temptation, okay, you're not going to have it rearing its head. But with food, that is something that even at the darkest points of contest prep, regardless of palatability, food in itself, just the consumption of food in a non-restricted manner, that in itself can be tempting. And I think when you can shift perspective, like, this is an opportunity for me to build that evidence for myself that I can do this, I think you begin to develop that, or you continue to develop that skill. But I do think it takes a long time, a lot of repetition, and a lot of evidence to support those beliefs. And well, also remembering that, like, okay, these another point that you touched on is like these physiological responses, these adaptive components, as much as we might expect them and we welcome them in certain phases, they're temporary, they're transient, and they will pass alongside the regain of body fat. They'll pass alongside dropping off some fatigue. And when you can treat the diet in itself, or the fat loss phase, as, this is an appropriate time to be hungry, as opposed to, let's say, a state of caloric excess, where, if you are feeling dysregulated, if you're feeling so dysregulated that hunger is causing you non-adherence or leading you to eat more than, let's say, is on the plan, that may be something to take a closer look at, because technically in that state, I wouldn't consider that an expected physiological component.
Yeah, for sure. Knowing the season that you're in, right? So if you're in a season of muscle building or reverse dieting or even a maintenance phase, is going to be very different than being in a diet phase. And also, too, I think we are in a little bit of a prep culture right now, or at least it has been going on for years, where there's just this like pursuit of subsequent show after show after show after show. And there does come a point where you should take a break for your health, and you should allow those systems to regulate and balance and reach kind of a healthy homeostasis before you push again. It's not that you're not going to push or that you can't prep ever. If that's something that's important to you, by all means do that. But the problem is, I think we've created this like prep constantly
Mhm.
on stage, uh, social media, stage ready lean type culture. And that can be very problematic, especially from a women's health perspective, with that prolonged and chronic caloric restriction. So as much as totally, I'm the one who just gave you the little adherence speech. I think too, there are times when for your body and for your health, that restriction, there's a time and a place for it if your goal is stepping on stage and you are an athlete. If that's not the case, then we probably need to look at ways to make this work to achieve that body recomposition that's still optimal for your health. This is one reason too for uh, me, after many seasons of prolonged dieting and chronic dieting and even doing multiple preps, there was a time and a place to be like, hey, like this probably isn't what's best for you, your health, your business, your ability to focus and be present in life. And so sometimes you got to shift gears, and that's okay too. So part of this is, I think, in the adherence conversation, that level of rigidity is going to look different than maybe a lifestyle or gym pop client, where maybe the conversation we're having is structured flexibility versus, hey, this is, we need you to be 100% on because you're competing for like the biggest show of your life. Two very, very different conversations that are going to require a different level of effort and adherence to accomplish the goal.
Of course, of course. And I think that the common pitfall I see, because I largely do work with women, is um, the stage lean look, or within 5 to 10 pounds of stage weight. It's become romanticized and seen as a status, something to sustain indefinitely in between seasons. And realistically, with even where the bikini division is going, like the muscularity requirements, even at the regional and the national level, they're greater. They're greater than they ever have been. And I do think that, again, like I'm leaning more into the cosmetic side of things, but when you look at overall health and the opportunity cost of sustaining those compositions, I mean, you are transiently accruing a debt, being in that state, and eventually you are going to have to pay it off. And that's where I would strongly encourage anyone who feels like, okay, contest prep is the only thing that motivates me enough to be adherent. I can tell you that, like, following a program that allows you to achieve said goal, said composition, or physique that's desired, doing so without that strict deadline can allow for a lot of personal development. And I mean, frankly, I just had this conversation with a client a couple of days ago. Is this point in my life, in my competition career, I have the most responsibility, I have the most stress off stage. But I can also say that having things that almost force me to really be clear about what parts of building, what parts of fat loss are the most important, and only devoting the necessary attention. Not, I mean, like, I really want to use the term mental masturbation, because that is what it is. People get lost in that kind of vacuum of, how can I spend every moment thinking about this show, thinking about food, obsessing around, the way to optimize every part of my protocol. And it's like, that in itself, that is a huge pain for a lot of clients in their ability to adhere, but also just in fatigue management.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you mentioned your level of responsibility and kind of just overall total workload, because I think surprisingly, one thing that will help your adherence, or maybe not surprisingly, is if you're busy, if you have hobbies, if you have things to do besides prep or besides your diet or besides thinking about food all day or thinking about going to the gym all day, those things can be very, very helpful. And so what I've actually noticed with both athletes and even in my own like personal health and fitness journey and prepping is sometimes folks with more professional responsibility or with other things to think about or other things to do, or people who have hobbies and aren't just hyper fixated on the prep itself, um, can avoid some of that mental masturbation that you referenced, or just overthinking it, or just, you can get very, if all you're doing is thinking about prep and food and how restricted you are and going to the gym, well, guess what? It's kind of, you're just bringing more attention to a known variable versus, hey, if you have a couple hobbies, if you have things you can do, if you have work responsibilities that you actually have to get things done. I know certainly since being a business owner and being responsible for other individuals as well as clients, team members, myself, family members, you know, you're going to actually take a step out of the kitchen. You're going to be at your computer, and all of a sudden, a few hours have gone by. And yes, like actually, it is time to eat again versus when you're hanging out and you eat your food and then you're just thinking about more food. So there's a lot to be said about that. I think, where sometimes responsibility or having other things to do can facilitate positive outcomes versus thinking like, oh, I'm just going to sleep, train, and eat all day, and that's going to be the way that I approach this. Well, the problem is you're going to be thinking a lot about eating and training, which you already have kind of a stressor there in and of itself.
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, you're just prolonging it. You're finding every moment that you can available to, kind of feel that suck. And it's like, well, that probably isn't a good use of the little mental faculty that you have left. Um, a an area I want to touch on, and I think that this can be applied, yes, I would say largely more towards the lifestyle client, the non-competitor. Um, when you're working with someone who, let's say, maybe struggling with some non-adherence, maybe struggling with just not seeing the progress that they were hoping for, they were expecting. We see that it's dietary related. We see there's some dietary fatigue accruing in the background. Maybe we're not at the point where it makes sense to, shut it down. What are some times, or I guess like some specific instances where you would encourage modifying the actual food selection? And I know like this is, I hope listeners can discern that this is all under the assumption, yes, we're sticking with single ingredient foods, whole food sources largely. But let's say for the client who is, they don't have that strict deadline. They are seeking, some variability in their programming. Do you think at times it can make sense to encourage more fun foods, more palatable foods?
Really depends on the person's diet history, health history, relationship with food, and how long we've actually been following a single ingredient whole food approach. So if this is like week 2 of you doing that, then probably what we're feeling is we want to change to revert back to what we were doing before. That's probably where those sentiments are coming from. Versus if this is someone who's just consistently always making those nutrient dense choices and we're incorporating variety. My stance on this is that life already will kind of throw you some curveballs in this area. And I prefer to have it be related to an experience with friends, family, loved ones. If it's your 3-year-old's birthday or it's your anniversary, or something where you're having some sort of connection or enjoyment around food or the meal, that's not just you grabbing something from your pantry, logging that you ate it or not logging that you ate it and just going to town on a particular snack or food, which I'm sure has, happened to the best of us. But the reason I emphasize kind of that community component is just there's so many things that can happen from both the stress and digestion perspective, being present, enjoying that food, chewing the food. Now, there's some food that just has very minimal nutrient density from a micronutrient perspective, or protein, higher in calories, hypercaloric, hyperpalatable, not really doing a lot for us. Certainly, there are those foods out there, and if that's something that um, there's like a individual sort of scorecard on this, it's almost like core values in terms of your business. My preference is I don't really want that to be like a hyper regular thing for people, but I'm not against an occasional incorporation, especially for things that we talked about, right? If this is your child's birthday or it's date night or it's something like that, right? That's different to go ahead and enjoy those things and do it with someone versus if we're talking about like you're just kind of closet eating a sleeve of Oreos. I don't really view that as like a healthy behavior, right? Versus going and
Mhm.
enjoying a nice meal with your family, that adds ROI to other buckets of your life. So I have more of like a common sense approach to it. I'm not super strong one direction or the other. I think it really depends on the client's metabolic health, what we're seeing in their labs. Do we have certain hereditary risk factors for things? If you have a ton of blood sugar issues and we haven't had an ability to regulate that yet, we do probably need to be mindful of, single ingredient whole foods and micronutrient density and not overdoing the hypercaloric, hyperpalatable foods. If you're super lean, have robust metabolic health, a ton of muscle tissue. You're great at, um, maybe leaving a couple bites on the plate, not overdoing it. You don't have like binge eating tendencies. Maybe for you, you have a little bit more food freedom there. But I still think structured flexibility is kind of a good thing. And I do generally try to encourage people to enjoy those experiences with loved ones or friends or community and have some other beneficial component to it versus, you just kind of solely going to town on like something that's thousands of calories that isn't really like adding a ton of value for you there, because it is kind of junk food at the end of the day, right? So we do want to optimize our nutrition for metabolic health as best we can. And if there's some things that, they're reminiscent of your childhood or whatever, you really happen to enjoy those things, I think you can figure out a way to make it work again in seasons for clients. But most people, if they're newer, we're probably not at that phase yet. And for people who have been doing this for a long time, they're probably going to approach it more responsibly. I think there's kind of a middle ground, um, with those food, because they're like, it's like super powerful and
Yeah.
palatable. Like you're literally giving someone the keys to have, stuff that's very easy to overeat, very hard to kind of regulate consumption, and and building that as a skill. So it's just having the awareness that like, hey, I mean, I never would have been able to previously have like a kid's cup of ice cream or dessert or, like, especially during, like past, whether it was like preps or anything else, or going out to eat, right? And just wanting to order like so many different things off the menu. That takes time to develop that skill. And it's also okay if you feel like you do have a tendency to overeat those things. So we have to set ourselves up for success versus setting ourselves up for failure. So I apologize if that's not like super specific. Can use myself as a, example. Like I used to have long time ago. I mean, I didn't even know if I was 20 years old yet, but I wanted to be like, uh, striving towards like bodybuilding and physique. It was like each week free meal of, pizza or like Reese's puffs and boxes of cereal and like cookie and all these things. I'm like, why are we doing this? Like you're not even enjoying, and especially in a lot of cases, in college or after that, like some of the times this was like by myself, it just, that
Mm.
that's entirely different than if you're like, hey, I'm going to go out with my family and we're going to have a really nice dinner and we got, these foods that I don't normally eat during the week or prepare at home, and I think they're super tasty and they're some of my favorites, and XYZ, right? Those are, I'm just trying to say, paint the picture that there's like two very different ways to consume foods, and,
Mm.
foods of varying nutrient density. So I'm still kind of, experiencing the flip side of that, right? Because I think when I was someone who was prepping more regularly and had more kind of rigid rules around food, that didn't always like play out super great. I mean, I was able to regulate my weight and prep and followed the plan, and the free meals were part of the plan. Whereas now I'd almost rather give someone like more calories across the week and more variety in their foods, more nutrient density, and then like versus these like haphazard eating patterns. If we're talking about if we're optimizing for health, then I think that's a different conversation. Versus, yeah, you can get away with it on prep because of your activity level or these other things, but is that actually what's best for us from a longevity perspective? And I think I've just become more sensitive to that as having family members with different chronic illnesses or health issues or, past cardiovascular events. You just, as you mature, you kind of, what matters to you more is that health side of the coin versus I'm optimizing my diet so that I can eat a box of cereal, and just crush it and like not worry about it. Um, Two totally different conversations. So,
No.
I'm not sure if that was helpful, but that's my life experience on that. And biggest thing I could encourage people to do is if you are going to occasionally have some fun foods, I would just say, try to do it with people that, friends, family, etc. Like make it more of an experience versus this like hyper fixated food relationship.
I think you expressed that extremely well. And I think you built a really nice picture around what that looks like for different individuals at different parts in their journey in their career, whether they're, I don't know, building an actual career in fitness or they're simply just, aspiring for a specific benchmark in fitness. I do agree, though. I think that there needs to be some kind of awareness around the motivation for having like hyper palatable foods. Very similar to you, the relationship around those foods for myself has shifted dramatically, coming from more of that background where it was like glorified and very much about pure consumption. And I think once I was able to see that that's what it wasn't even the actual process of of going out to eat on a date or going in and sharing this meal. It was very much like, I just want to consume this food because it's not on plan, like
Yeah.
very adolescent, right? Like
Yeah.
very just
I'm
anti.
just gonna crush it because I can.
Yeah.
And also at the time, I think it was like popular to just be documenting like the size of these meals and the calories and how much food you could put down. And there's like a novelty to it. And so I think that's changed a little bit, fortunately, but I totally agree. There was like a completely different, almost like a different narrative around it at that time. And it was much more mindless eating
Yeah.
versus like a true enjoyment. Like if you're going to eat those foods, like at least chew your food and actually like taste what you're eating and then think
Yeah.
about if you want more of it. I unfortunately for a couple of years was on the like vacuum cleaner inhalation style approach, which I would not recommend. If I could go back and change that, I
Mhm.
would. Fortunately, I didn't do it for very long, but one of my first preps that was definitely, unfortunately, made its way onto the program here and there.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean, and I think too when the food itself, when that can be built around an experience, I think it allows you to um, really assign the value to having a break from the diet and focus on the actual enjoyment of being out and not being on plan in a different way. I have a client who like recently we had this discussion around redesigning her meal plan because she feels like I'm getting a little too wild with these food choices. They're turning into overindulgences, and I'm not happy with that. So I asked her, I'm like, hey, like, okay, tell me just what are the foods that you want on a regular basis? And of 5 meals, 4 of them had chocolate in them. And I'm like, okay, I don't, I'm going to tell you, like, I don't think that's like fueling your performance here. And like, I love hyper palatable food. I do. I enjoy it and I can over enjoy it to a point. But in this case, I'm like, hey, I think we're using this more as a crutch and
Corey,
less.
you're not going to make me make a case against chocolate here on this show. I'm not going to do it. I understand the client situation that you're talking about. So I think sometimes when this happens is because we've sort of skirted around this topic, but why this happens sometimes is I do see a lot of women, especially dieting on these conventional like chicken breasts and vegetables and turkey and fish and maybe some rice or potatoes or whatever, and even incorporating, lean red meat or grass fed beef, incorporating some food rotation, uh, wild, whether it's wild game, other fish, fatty fish, other protein sources, whole eggs, not just egg whites. There's still a culture of I'm going to do whatever I can to include a tablespoon of peanut butter in all my meals, but never having any other sort of fat source or um, getting by with egg whites and chicken. Obviously, these foods are low calorie and do help to manage hunger in a sense, but it almost perpetuates an additional problem related to your hunger and then future cravings because we're trying to like volume hack. We're eating all these very lean protein foods with very little dietary fat, and then when we are having fat, we're mainly adding it from nut butters or nuts and seeds or bars and these different foods that may upset our digestion, which then can further kind of compound these issues. So if you are someone who tends to follow that diet that's you know lean white proteins and vegetables volume hacked with cauliflower rice, and you're just like living to I mean, years ago it was like Walden's Farms was like the popular thing that I would see, and then people would have like tons of gut issues and stuff. But there's just I think in that case, you could really benefit from like, hey, let's rotate. This actually happened in a consult with IFBB Pro, who is actually like progressing towards the Olympia stage. And this was years ago, but I mean, she was anemic, had pretty significant inflammation, lots of oxidative stress. Obviously, you're going to have stress going into a prep like that. But part of these issues could have been alleviated through improving her iron status, including lean red meats. Maybe you're having some fruit and other types of carbohydrates aside from just like two kinds, like rice and oats or rice and potatoes. And then with the protein sources, getting more vitamins and minerals, adding micronutrient support through supplementation. I mean, sometimes I think people think that they want these foods, but it's also because they're not necessarily getting a variety of food either through how they're setting their macronutrient, or how their coach is setting their macronutrients and how they're choosing to follow that, or if they are given a meal plan from a coach who doesn't know much about micronutrition and they're only trying to adhere and hit certain macros. That does lead to a lot of these issues that we're seeing. Now, not always is it like chocolate 4 or 5 times a day, but hey, maybe if we're breaking it up into a very small serving, it could be done. But just trying to paint the picture of how some of this comes to fruition at times is a result of poor planning on the front end by the coach, and then the client. That would be an example where the client is definitely more likely to do that. Now, in Corey's case, that's probably not what's happening with this client. She's just hitting a point where she's craving that particular food. We might need to figure out what is the association with that food. Is it the sweetness, or are we missing something else in terms of the picture? Sometimes it's they're not enjoying any of their other meals, even those healthy foods that they're eating. So let's actually incorporate some single ingredient whole foods. Maybe it would be nice for you to eat a different color vegetable for once, or actually have some fruit or something instead of just, yeah, you have, I mean, for a long time, right? It was like chicken, rice, and broccoli or tilapia. Well, if you're still doing that, that's partially why you're feeling this like drive to go consume these other things. And that can be avoided because that's on target from a macronutrient perspective. Those very simple, like lower calorie, higher volume foods, that doesn't necessarily mean it's best from a because total nutrition should incorporate micronutrients, vitamins, antioxidants. And we're not just looking at protein and, because eventually that will stall out. So like for that individual, when we were looking at it, like very clearly presented in the labs, this person looked like they had some serious metabolic health issues. And it was even for someone being very lean, starting to impact things like insulin sensitivity, iron status, inflammatory markers, thyroid markers, right? And then all of a sudden, what was happening? Puffy, inflammation, retaining water, couldn't lose weight, the scale wouldn't move, progress photos were looking progressively worse. And it could all be fixed through some of those dietary modifications, some rest days, and then easily getting things back on track. And guess what? That person was actually looking forward to their meals because we changed, to not eat the same thing. We're not having like tilapia and asparagus for the fourth time, on a given day. And so there are seasons where you are probably more restrictive with a prep, but also understand there's room for these things, like whether it's a whole egg or occasionally including some lean red meat. Those things can happen, especially when we're talking about like months of prep versus like
Mm.
final weeks. I understand obviously stage manipulations, people may have certain foods that they're used to or that their coach likes to use, but sometimes we're talking about like 10 weeks out and people are pretty much eating the same protein source all day long. So went
I
on my soapbox a little bit for that one, but sorry, Corey.
No, 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 no. I'm so glad you did, because I mean, like, I think that's a really great way to round this out, is like, um, through what some might deem as like, structuring things, I would say a little more rigidly, or having the like denying them from, let's say something that's hyper palatable. It's like, okay, that doesn't necessarily have to be creating this state of restriction. That could actually encompass some of the solution that is associated with the dysregulated hunger signaling, or even the dysregulation in food behaviors. So, Sam, I think this conversation was amazing. I know listeners will have enjoyed this. I would love to have them go follow you. I'd love to have them go check out all of your content and learn from you. Where can they find you at?
Well, thank you, Corey. I appreciate it. And also you let me go on a couple rants, which was great. And then I feel like you got you had your own little stories in there too. So it was a fun conversation. If you're interested in any of my content, educational material, best places to start, usually on Instagram. I'm very active there and also have a podcast. Both are Sam Miller Science and sammillerscience.com. I wrote a book called Metabolism Made Simple. So if you're wanting to dive into really more on conceptualizing metabolism and some of what we talked about today in terms of stress and energy regulation, as well as tools for the different seasons of nutrition, that would be a great place to start, even if you're in your own transformation and not necessarily a coach. If you are a coach or health professional and you're wanting to learn more about how to help clients like the ones we talked about today, both hypothetical and real world examples, you want to head over to metabolismschool.com. That's the home of the functional nutrition and metabolism specialization program. So when we were alluding to things like biofeedback and health testing, that's really what we're diving into through that live program and mentorship. So either one of those is going to be a great place to start. I'd say I'm most active in free content, mainly in the podcast and on social media.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you guys for listening. And as always, I will see you in the next one.